So thank you for joining us at the Teaching and Professional Track Faculty discussion. Many of you know, DU, we've led in this area, right? 6 years ago, we put forth in our new APT guidelines for actually recognizing, structuring, organizing all types of faculty series, not just the tenure track series. And through that, we created formal processes for review and promotion. We gave contracts with increasing lengths as individuals progress through their career. But we in all new things, you're never perfect. You have to iterate and learn along the way. And my hope is that we'll continue to lead the nation as we did with our own tenure and promotion guidelines. But now we need to focus on how do we actually implement the growth of the career, the development of the individual, the actual excellence and quality measurement of those activities that these lines are designed and required to do. Many of you know that in research, when I was in research, I was really passionate around not having second-class citizens. And I opened up a lot of the internal seed funding opportunities to all faculty lines, instead of it being limited to one. I want to make sure that as we move forward that we all are doing the same thing. It takes more than one person to truly integrate and create space for these new lines to thrive, grow, and contribute. We need to figure out how to be consistent across our practices. We need to figure out how to do this with excellence. We need to recognize we're learning as we're doing, and it's okay to try, and it's okay to not be perfect. We also need to really think about how we launch careers and we develop careers, not just in tenure lines, but on all the faculty lines that are on campus. Some are a little bit more difficult than others, but I think we can make great progress in this area. So I'm really excited to introduce Laura Sponsler, who has been supporting the Office of Teaching and Learning, and so really the Office of the Provost, both with her expertise in her chosen research field, but also in her practical classroom experience. She's really helping us move the needle in understanding how to promote excellence in teaching and how to move forward all these teaching and professional lines. So please welcome Laura.
Good afternoon, back again. So this morning, I was fortunate to publicly thank and acknowledge my advisor and mentor, our morning keynote, Dr. Matt Hartley. And this afternoon, I'm truly honored to introduce my academic hero, Dr. Adriana Kezar. Dr. Kezar is the Dean's Professor of Leadership, Wilbur Kiefer Professor of Higher Education at the University of Southern California, and Director of the Peleus Center for Higher Education. Dr. Kezar is an exceptional scholar and leader in our field, with expertise around changing faculty trends and non-tenure track faculty, shared governance, institutional culture and organizational change, and STEM education. Broadly speaking, her research agenda examines the change process of institutions and the roles of leadership in creating change. She's published over 18 books and monographs, over 100 articles and book chapters, and her work has been cited over 10,000 times. 9,000 was me. No, just kidding. My joke writer, Sarah Hurtado, thank you for that one. I was actually speaking with Sarah earlier this week in my office, rather nervously, about this presentation, and we both realized and acknowledged that I don't think I've written a paper that didn't cite Dr. Kezar's work. In a review of my syllabi, I think maybe 1 or 2 classes in my 5 years here haven't cited your work. So Dr. Kezar's influence on our field is truly profound, and her scholarship both challenges and inspires me daily. So in my role as the resident scholar for teaching and professional faculty, I consistently refer to her work on non-tenure track faculty or faculty off the tenure track, and the work of the Delphi Project on changing faculty and student success. Dr. Kezar is one of the foremost experts on this topic, and we are honored to welcome here today to help us think more deeply, more creatively, and more expansively about the role of our teaching and professional faculty in shared governance in higher education. Dr. Kezar, thank you for sharing your expertise with us and for challenging us to transform our institutions to be more just, more equitable, and more democratic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adriana Kezar for her keynote address.
Thank you.
what's going on. That was a really generous, is this on? Yes, a really generous introduction. I am really happy to be here with you today, and I'm going to probably move around and a little bit more and sit down and stand up and try to keep us all active because we're after lunch now, and so just want to make sure that we keep the room energized as we move forward. And this is a topic that, as Laura said, is very near and dear to my heart. I have been concerned about, for many, many years, the changes in the faculty that are happening that go unaddressed by our campuses. So this was a trend that was largely invisible for many years. And it was actually my work on institutional change that helped me to see this issue and how important it is. I was, 20 years ago when I would go to campuses and I was looking, I do a lot on teaching, the improvement of teaching and learning. And people used to say things like, well, the reward structures don't support, teaching and learning. That was kind of one of the kind of common barriers. And then probably 12 years ago, people started saying things like, well, it's really hard to, get this new wave calculus in place because the faculty are here one semester and gone the next. And I was like, this is an interesting, different trend that I'm hearing about. And started me looking into and thinking about the changes that were happening in the faculty. And my background is always on the organizational end and the lack of kind of changes within our campuses to better support the faculty as they were changing. What were our policies and practices? And we were not being aware of some of these trends. And so some of the trends that I started to look at and that people started to see is anyone want to guess what that yellow line is? Yeah, so the tenure track faculty, and the red line is part-time, and the white one that people have tended to forget about as much is the full-time, non-tenure track. And these trends have been going on, and many campuses that I would go out to would say things like, well, that's just happening in community colleges, or that's only happening in composition. And as I would come forward with the data to people, I would say, actually, it's happening across all institutional types. And most institutions have just over 50% faculty who are, and I'm going to use the term, I know here on campus you use professional and teaching faculty, and every campus I go to uses a slightly different term. So sometimes I'll use faculty off the tenure track or non-tenure track faculty in our discussion here today, just as it is more normatively used. My preference is just for the term faculty in general across all faculty groups. This also, if I had a bar chart here for the disciplines, you would see it crosses every discipline. So people used to say, well, this isn't happening, in mathematics or biology or chemistry. And yes, it is indeed. So it is a trend that is very widespread. These are your own figures over time that really are almost identical to the national trends I just showed you. So it was those changes that prompted me to start the project, which really just started by bringing together, I brought together every stakeholder group across higher education, governing boards and presidents, policymakers, accreditors, faculty groups from various disciplinary societies, the academic unions, the New Faculty Majority, which was a group that was advocating for faculty that were off the tenure track. So all the kind of major stakeholder groups that related to the faculty role, and kind of laid out this question of, these are the changing trends. What should we do as a higher education community? And here's the evidence and research we have about this group, their experience, how it's shaping our institutional and student outcomes. And out of that group came two really important suggestions. One was, we as institutions are woefully not acting in ways that support these faculty. We need to change our policies and practices. It was clear evidence from that group, and they've all been partners in trying to find ways to create resources and to disseminate those to campuses to do the kind of work that you're doing here, to have task forces on campus that examine your policies. What they said to me, though, is higher education is an extremely complex organization. So you cannot have a list of just do these things, because every institution has different mission, different size, different governing bodies we've been talking about today. So rather than prescribe suggestions for every campus, come up with a process of inquiry for campuses so they can explore, given their specific situation, what might they do to better support faculty who are off the tenure track. And so those of you who have not visited the Delphi website, please do, because it has, if this topic is of interest to you, because it has on there all sorts of resources that this group collectively helped develop, that is a part of helping each campus on this journey. Secondly, the group said, and we need to think about new faculty models going forward. What should the faculty be? Like, is it, if we don't think that exactly the models that exist now are the ones that will be in the future, how can you help campuses to think about that? And we have some of those resources on the website as well. And one of the things that, as I started to do research in this area, a decade ago, that was so important, that kept coming up in my study. So I would study, faculty off the tenure track. I'd look at them in departments where, say, they felt well supported, those where they felt like they could, teach very well, support students. One of the things that kept coming up in that research was the importance of their participation in governance. So it's one of the things that I want to talk to you about today. And tell you, though, what we know about this new population and governance is very little, because there really hasn't been a lot of research. So I'm going to talk to you about what exists, and then with some of these collective groups that I'm working with, like the AAUP, what are some of their recommendations that many people have been bringing together thoughtful groups around this issue. The latest study, so AAUP did a study about 10 years ago on this group, and their numbers were slightly less than you'll see here today. So these are some of the latest numbers for participation. So this has definitely been arcing up. And this study, because there is no really good national data, was about 106 institutions that were doctoral institutions. And they asked about faculty senate eligibility. And as you can see, these numbers would have been quite different a few, 10 years ago. But now there are very few where only tenure track faculty are eligible, and the majority now have full-time non-tenure track faculty eligible to be in senates and to participate actively on their campuses. Most campuses still do not have active participation among their part-time faculty in governance. And they looked at, were there kind of any institutional characteristics that were associated with differences in participation, and could find nothing really there, that this is sort of, if you will, the norm for today of participation in governance. One of the things, though, that they also did was reviewed some of the policies out there. And this also, I think, reinforces earlier studies by the AAUP that there is, even though there are some rules around eligibility and participation, they talked about how faculty handbooks were not as clear on things like compensation, how this would play into evaluation. Sort of the accompanying rules were either written in ways that were unclear, or there was ambiguity about some of the details. And so one of the takeaways from their study was that we are at a point in time where, while at least 15 years ago, when AAUP did some of its earlier studies, faculty were not even eligible or participating in governance. Now that's become, the norm, but there's not as much clarity around that role. And I think really that's the place we're in, is really trying to define better our policies in the realm of governance. Some of the earlier studies leading up in these participation studies even look, though, at the interest of faculty who are off the tenure track to participate in governance. And in particular, Baldwin and Chronister were just focusing on the full-time non-tenure track. And they, found that consistently that non-tenure track faculty are interested in, because sometimes I've been on campuses where there's a feeling, well, they don't want to participate in governance, so we don't want this as a burden we're trying to put on them. So I think most of the research suggests that there is interest among the population to be involved in governance. And I think what my research has really focused on is some of the benefits and the reasons for the interest in this involvement. And so as I've studied, the ways the non-tenure track faculty, their experience in their departments and their institutions, is that faculty who are prevented from having input on, say, the curriculum or their textbooks or information about learning objectives or having input on learning objectives. So all of the kind of things that shape the teaching and learning environment, to not have input on that would dramatically alters their, use their words, willingness and capacity and opportunity to be successful teachers. So if I'm not able to have some kind of control, and I had so many of these stories of faculty members, saying, there were, 20 of us who were off the tenure track who were teaching, Chemistry 101. The assigned textbook was, really terrible. We were trying to tell everybody we needed to change. We were putting forth this new book, and we couldn't get anyone to, and so the faculty who were making decisions about the book weren't teaching the course. And the frustration of the faculty members and how it was impacting their ability to be really successful teachers. So they would I had many and many of these stories that I collected about how they felt it prevented them in being as successful as they could as teachers. So that was one level. The other is that by participating in shared governance, these faculty members could try to shift some of the institutional policies that they knew were problematic for them. So a lot of the tenure track faculty who are responsible for making the policies on campus don't know about ones that have a negative impact on the non-tenure track faculty members. So what they were able to do, through participating in governance, is to reshape some of those policies and practices. And if they're not able to, then those perpetuated, continuing to make their work lives challenging, more challenging than they wanted. So they might say things like, it would be really important if there, were policies that enabled the non-tenure track faculty to participate in professional development. But the way the policies are currently done, for example, the seed funding for to go off to a teaching conference are restricted, and I don't have access to those. And so I would like to see those policies changed. So it was only through them being able to participate in governance that they could point out some of these problematic policies that impacted their ability to be as strong as teachers as possible. And then thirdly, they talked a lot about how this affected the overall institutional climate or morale, because as long as they were not able to interact with either their tenure track colleagues or peers or members of the administration, they were isolated and didn't feel a part of the community. And this was some of the ways that they became greater part of the community, whether it was in their department, being involved in departmental governance, up to school, and up to the university. So those various levels, any ways that they could be involved created greater senses of community and built the morale for those areas. So over the years, various studies I've done have sort of illustrated the value, both for the institution, because I would say having better policies and practices in place and an improved morale are things that improve the institution, but they certainly were extremely beneficial for the faculty who are off the tenure track, who often are at a disadvantage. For those of you who may need still more persuading, one of the publications that we have on the Delphi website, because many campuses talk about how they have colleagues who maybe aren't sure about the need for this to be a priority on their campus. And this is one of the publications that we produced that was trying to help raise up in visibility what are some of the problems that originate from not, as a campus, taking forward this issue of trying to create better policies and practices for faculty off the tenure track. And this is not something you may need, but I think just highlighting it for colleagues you may have that are still wrestling with this. We highlight some of the studies that look at, because of lack of support, often faculty off the tenure track are not able to help students in terms of graduating or persisting. There's studies that say that, that faculty who are off the tenure track often can't provide the kind of support for students because they don't get the professional development, the mentoring or support. So knowing the impact that not including non-tenure track faculty and governance, the impact it can have on the student learning environment on your campus. Other campuses often have a commitment, particularly some of the private colleges that I have worked with, to social justice and sort of the equity issues that are really important for their campus, that thinking about some of the inequalities that exist between faculty is seen as an unfair issue. Thirdly, and the administrators really seem to be compelled by this, but there's also a significant risk management issue in terms of, on many campuses, faculty off the tenure track don't have offices, so they don't have a private space to give advising to students, or they often are not, included in, say, sexual harassment training. We're required in California to do this, but they may not be included in some of the trainings that are mandatory for campuses to be in compliance. So some of the ways that some of the faculty fall outside of our typical policies can be extremely problematic. So thinking through that, we really do have an imperative to change, and this change is going to be much more successful if we're including all of the faculty in that process. And it is not just myself who is calling for this. There are lots of important groups across the country. And so back in 2016, the Association for Governing Boards came out with a report called Consequential Boards, Adding Value Where It Matters. And they were calling for the inclusion of faculty who are off the tenure track in shared governance on campuses, and saying, with the faculty having changed so much, how can we truly say, that we are having a representative, faculty voice when they are not included? And so they really were calling upon campus leaders in particular to be thinking about their shared governance structures and to be bringing in along the non-tenure track faculty. So there's beginning to be a lot of support behind this. The rationale that is provided behind including non-tenure track faculty in governance is varied and widespread, actually, and it comes from, as I said, that some of this is drawn from some of these national reports by national associations, some of this is drawn from the AAOP, and some of this is drawn from research. But the argument goes that participation in governments is a primary right of faculty members. We've seen this in some of the historic documents like the AGB, AAUP, ACE statement on shared governance that I know Matt shared with you earlier. And it's part of being a faculty as a professional, that they have input into their work, that where they are experts. And so this is part of, as institutions, us keeping the integrity of the academic profession, right? Because it is through involvement in shared governance that faculty have input on issues around curriculum and teaching and learning. So it's very important for them to have that voice. Others have argued that it really undermines the issue of equity when there are different appointment types, and that impacts the climate, which I mentioned. Much of my research has shown that over time, and that participation in governance really, as I had mentioned too, builds the community, like the value of all members of the community. So as I was talking about in terms of issues of climate and morale, this is really important. Getting more to the less idealistic and more practical brass tacks, dwindling few tenure track faculty are overwhelmed with governance. And this has been a real issue on lots of campuses. And this recognition that a tenure track faculty are talking about being overwhelmed by the amount of service or work that they have. And as we do not involve faculty off the tenure track more in these activities, we don't have an amenable workload on many campuses. As the AGB statement argued, as the percentage of tenure track faculty in institution dwindles, this is not representative of the faculty's views anymore, the typical shared governance system we have. The AAUP argued also that a lot of the non-tenure track faculty have experience from other institutions, sometimes work at multiple institutions, and that this can be important to the overall thinking and problem solving of a shared governance process on campus. I've also kind of like hit those ones on the bottom, but as you can see, there is a growing, expansive rationale behind doing this. But what is this? The predicament. And this has long been discussed the last 10 years, back and forth between different groups. The exclusion from governance is problematic, but the inclusion is not without some problems as well. And these are some of the things that campuses need to think through. So as mentioned in that earlier study, for the full-time non-tenure track faculty, often has been the case that it's very unclear in their contracts, the role of shared governance. And of course, for unsalaried part-time faculty, this is often outside, with their purview of their work, and they have little or no compensation. For all faculty that are off the tenure track, they may get no formal recognition or credit. Again, it's not particularly written into any of our standard policies. If their term contracts are short, we don't know if they will be able to complete a project. And not every campus has academic freedom policies in place for faculty off the tenure track. They might be subject to retaliation in carrying out their governance duties, and they may feel beholden to department chairs or administrators who hire or reappoint them. So it's not without its challenges. So this is many of the concerns that have been raised, and I'm sure on any campus that I've been to, as they think about this issue, while there is very, very compelling rationale, there is also this issue of the predicament that rises up. So I don't want to come to you and say that this is not unproblematic either. But I do want to say, and I really agree with the AAUP and what they concluded around this issue, which is, on the whole, the exclusion from governance of faculty with a contingent appointment is a greater danger to the integrity of the profession than those concerns that were raised. So I think that this is the balance that we are trying to achieve, is how do you consider that important rationale and try to balance out and, to the degree possible, get rid of those things that are a predicament that make it challenging to include the faculty. So the AAUP has tried to give really good guidance on this issue around eligibility. I think that I just want to point out here 2 or 3 things that I think are really important. And one of them is, the fact that they are providing, as I said, the overall rationale for including, but trying to think about those issues that get in the way of academic freedom, due process, that need to be addressed before campuses can successfully move forward. So here are some of the conditions that they talk about that would be challenging for contingent faculty, and the things that you can do. So they recommend first an institutional audit, right, of what are some of the practices that need to be remedied. So they talked about inadequate record-keeping systems that make it difficult to determine eligibility or even to contact non-tenure track faculty. Talked about faculty turnover that might get away, or low compensation or no compensation for involvement in governance. So they trying to outline a few here, but each campus would potentially have different issues of practices that might need to be remedied before one moved forward. But they also talked about, and this is why I'd love to suggest you look at the Delphi website. You look at other institutions that have already moved forward with including the faculty in shared governance. There are many campuses that now are doing this, and to pull some of the best practices from those campuses for ways they've overcome some of those challenges. So they also point to, and I think that this is another really important one, is that that they be eligible for voting in all elections. So I think that sometimes when we think about governance, and I think you also can start small, like thinking about, I know at our campus we started with departments and started to move up. What was the way that non-tenure track faculty were involved with departmental service? And then we thought more about school service and the level at which, again, they would be able to vote on, say, and participate in faculty councils. And then it moved up to our Senate. So it was various levels, both trying to increase the inclusion, ensure voting, which had not always, we hadn't included them in governance, and then we didn't include them always in voting once they were included in governance, and trying to be more consistent over time across departments. And so this kind of thinking through the eligibility of voting is a really critical area. So in terms of outlining specific areas then, they might be restricted on things like tenure and tenure track faculty, appointments and promotion, but they should really be involved in the contributing to the evaluation of other contingent faculty. So thinking through where are the decisions that makes most sense for faculty to be involved. And really critical, and in some of our question and answer time, I would love to talk about this, is thinking through the ways that campuses can protect faculty off the tenure track from retaliation, particularly around the issue of non-reappointment, because many of you may have read stories in the Chronicle. They come up now and again of faculty who are not rehired, who've spoken out against the administration of a campus or been vocal. And so really thinking through the kind of due process rights that faculty have is really important to ensure that issue, because this is again part of that risk and predicament. This is, we do have many instances that have come up across the country where faculty are not reappointed. So this is a real issue where you need to think through the protections on your campus. Alongside this in terms of compensation. So I've seen a lot of campuses where they open up the doors and involve individuals in shared governance, but they don't think through the kinds of compensation that faculty would have or how it would be structured into their contracts. And I will say that study by Jones that just came out, that was very much so one of their findings, is they couldn't find it clearly in contracts how compensation would be dealt with. And so thinking that through, and that it's not required, expected, or pressured without some ways that this is formally structured into the role. And I've seen going out to campuses working on this, I don't think it's intentional, it's just often overlooked. And that's why I want to point out some of these recommendations specifically, because I think as people are well-meaningly trying to give more voice to faculty off the tenure track, giving voice but without giving compensation, without protecting from retaliation and some of these other things is not as responsible to do. So I really appreciate the AAU's recommendations are really thinking through ways to do this in responsible ways that both help faculty to be a part of the overall campus environment and be a professional in that environment, but do so in a way that is protecting them in that responsibility. So this also points to this including it as part of the evaluation of the faculty member. So along with overlooking compensation, it's often overlooked as including it in the evaluation of the faculty member. So participating in things that don't go towards what I'm credited for or rewarded for can be problematic over time, especially as you try to build out and get more faculty involved. So this is another consideration that the AAUP asks faculty to look at. So before I go on, I was going to talk about some best practices. I wanted to stop there for a minute and see if anybody has just some questions as we're thinking about the rationale behind including faculty, the predicament as I laid it out, and some of the recommendations for a way forward that is a meaningful and responsible way to include faculty off the tenure track. Just want to see if there are some questions before we get into some of the best practices on campuses.
So my question is in relation to what was mentioned of maybe not having non-tenure track faculty which is what you're using, in deciding or voting for tenured processes, tenured hires or tenured processes. In the reverse, has there ever been a discussion of not having tenure track faculty be involved in the vote of hiring and promotion of the other lines, in the same way that potentially there's some understandings that are missing? I'm going to leave it at that.
Yeah, no, so great question. Thank you. So I'm going to give you example. So at USC, and when we do, I'll get to the hiring, but when we do our annual evaluations, it's the faculty off the tenure track. Again, I can use teaching and professional. I'm using that as the general term. It's our teaching faculty who evaluate other teaching faculty, and the tenure track faculty do the evaluation for the tenure track faculty. And the rationale there is they have the most expertise around those roles and then should do the equivalent evaluation. Right now, when it comes to hiring, I would say it ends up slightly being de facto that the teaching faculty end up on. They're the primary people on our hiring committees, but tenure track faculty, they're invited to be included, don't always end up participating. So in a strange de facto way, it's not that they're prohibited from being on the search committees, but we ask for volunteers. And usually it's the teaching faculty who volunteer for the hiring and search committees for that group. And when I've been to other campuses, there's definitely a move when it comes around to evaluation processes. And I think in hiring, I've seen it mixed, where both kinds of groupings have emerged. Especially, I think, in our environment, we're hiring so many of the teaching faculty compared to the tenure track faculty, and so just it comes out by sheer numbers that it gets divided out like that often, in terms of who's responsible. Yeah, Ryan. Oh yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think it is more common, right, for it to be a mix on the teaching faculties and the tenure track lines. I'm trying to think of some of the schools I've been at. Have I seen ones where they intentionally make sure that they include faculty off the tenure track on the hiring for tenure track? And I'm sure I'm not able to raise any up in my head right now. I think, that I can't think of any directly right now, but it's certainly, again, there's no, I think that the biggest issue, at least with the AAUP, has been less so on the hiring line and it is on the promotion and tenure line, like the decision around tenure. They're holding pretty clear that that's the one thing, the one area. So they pretty much have said every other area is open, But just that decision seems to be the one where at least the AAUP and its recommendations is holding on to that being a tenure exclusive decision. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. One of the things I love about these events is we get a chance to talk to each other
Yeah.
and even share things that are happening here on our own campus. I'm from the Mortgage College of Education, and we have been working on and have just recently approved with our whole faculty both an appointment, promotion, and tenure group with processes and an appointments and promotion group with processes. So we actually are attempting to articulate an appointment and promotion process that's reflective of the work that's actually being done by teaching and professional faculty to recognize and honor work and create a system that's reflective of that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Got a
I've been given a different mic. I was actually one of the participants back in Baltimore in the first Delphi meeting.
Yeah.
And then also in the AAC&U offices
Yep.
a year or so later. And I was struck at that time that different disciplinary associations had different stakes in this. And my perception from the ones that I know best, which are in English and composition, that there's a lot of interest and activity within those groups. I don't know how much they're inflecting what's happening at institutions. And so my question is, as you're surveying what's going on, where's the energy for this coming from? Is it from the higher ed kinds of things, the disciplinary groups, or some combination?
So most of the energy that I have seen on, and this is hundreds of campuses now, is mobilizing by the, again, non-tenure track, the teaching or professional faculty themselves, that they're coming together, that they organize, and that they start to find allies among, tenure track faculty and administrators that they see as potential champions, and it really trickles from there. That I would say is about a good 75% of how the processes have moved forward. When it comes to external levers, accreditation is probably one of the biggest ones. Is that when it comes time for a self-study, faculty is a dimension on one of the key areas on an accreditation. So many of those groups on various campuses I've been on have levered an accreditation process because they do ask about, they meet with the faculty. And one of I was a commissioner for WASC, the Western Association, and one of the things that I've really been working with the accreditors on is asking to meet with all faculty groups, which they didn't used to do. They used to only meet with the tenure track faculty, and to through that get more information, and sort of like that has been a leverage point because now increasingly different accreditors are meeting with a broader group of faculty, understanding the issues across the campus more. So I am aware of many campuses that have utilized accreditation processes. Disciplinary societies have been used more so for not institution-wide changes, but certain departmental changes. So I have worked with, because some of our Delphi resources are focused more on departments, because I say start wherever you can. If you have departments or schools that are really interested in doing something, like start there. So in that effort, I have seen disciplinary societies be instrumental in being a resource, because many of them have subcommittees that are focused on this issue. But I think that what the disciplinary societies haven't been able to offer is they haven't been thinking at an institutional level. So they haven't been able to provide the advice to think beyond, like, what you might do in a whatever discipline, again, that they are associated with, for them to think through some policies at the departmental level. So I think that, yeah, it's some of these other groups that are thinking more at the institutional level, but it often bubbles up from those who are most affected by these issues.
Thank you. This is something I've been passionate about for a long time, to try to understand, or to get the teaching and professional faculty to be seen as a viable career choice, and to give them the opportunity and a voice in the campus. I have to say a couple of things. One, on terms of governance, on our own survey that we've done here, one of the things that is a common thread, there is no common thread. There's no consistency across this campus, other than the fact that something that has been alluded to by Nancy and others is that it tends to be that in terms of appointment and promotion of teaching and professional faculty, tenure track faculty are part of that, but teaching professional faculty tend not to be part of that discussion dealing with their tenure track colleagues. Something you alluded to, but just in passing, but I think is part of the elephant in the room that goes with governance, is compensation packages. The significant difference between the pay scale between tenure track faculty and teaching and professional faculty is enormous. And this is brought forth in a way that's almost, from my point, I'm just being honest, somewhat insulting. When we get the pay bumps between assistant, associate, associate to full, there's a big difference between that pay bump for the tenured faculty, track faculty, and the teaching and professional faculty. It may seem only like a few $1,000s, and yet it's a clear indication by the Board of Trustees that, in fact, we are second-class citizens, because they don't value the promotion as much. So I'd be curious to see if you've had any stories or a sense of success of institutions that are trying to narrow the gap. I recognize that my tenured colleagues are also concerned about their compensation packages with cost of living and being in Denver and whatnot. But is there any movement at all? Because quite frankly, we're cheaper, we teach more classes, and we have less power. But what a perfect combination for the administration to take advantage of, as far as I'm concerned. And they do. So have you seen any process by which they...
Yeah, so the institutions, I will say, are slightly unique, where I've seen the most of this work. And I mentioned when I said to you that one of the issues that is quite prevalent related to the teaching and professional faculty is that there are these equity issues when it comes to compensation and other kinds of issues around their work life. Often, aren't like, as I alluded to, they don't have opportunities for conference funding or kind of other things. It depends on the campus and different issues, but there can be an assortment of equity issues beyond the pay. And so most of the institutions I'm aware of that have done this have been ones that are religiously based, and they saw this as a social justice issue that I alluded to, that they could not continue to, given their beliefs and values. So they would, it was retreats with their board and their presidents and administration and the faculty that came to it, that this was not in line with the values that the institution espoused and their mission. And so those are the campuses that I've seen that have had the most traction. I've also been to other campuses where they wanted to do something, public institutions. Probably the ones, again, that have made the most progress are unionized campuses, like in California, where I'm at, where the unions have become less divided. They used to be the tenure track and the professional and teaching faculty were in either separate spheres, separate agreements, sometimes separate unions, and they've been sort of coming together in what they call more wall-to-wall contracts that then allow them to have, like, that they're fighting for more comparable salaries. So the environments in which these are happening are particular to some of the circumstances that they're in. So again, it's happening. I would like to say I wish it was happening on a more wide scale basis. Most, again, the campuses I talk to, if they're large publics, they're feeling strapped. There's no reason, for example, why like a place like USC that I'm at cannot do this, and it's part of one of our discussions right now, because actually have the finances to do it. So, some places they have a financial barrier. In others, it's become custom. And this is what's very unusual, is even beyond when institutions have the means, they've created this tiered system. So it is, something that, I think a lot of institutions are actively working on. And it has been one of the, I'll call it like the, one of our resources is called Dispelling the Myth, but it's about some campuses don't do anything because of cost. Like they think everything's going to cost. And so I talk about how there are lots of things you can do to better support teaching and professional faculty that don't cost a lot. And then there are things that do cost more. And but I say, as you start to, and this is where I've seen the progress is, as you start to see all the value you get, start investing. And then as you start to see, if you will, the return on your investment, they're moving across from the less expensive things to the more expensive things. So I don't think we're going to see it as the first thing out the gate. I really think people need to, at least the campuses I've seen, is they start to invest in more financially and see, better student persistence and alumni that are happier and things like that. Then over time, I think the compensation will begin to follow. But different things are going to happen at different campuses. As I would say, I think that this is definitely my experience. Not you see a trend here and it goes across the board. It's like things trickle up. But I mean, look at this. Like 10 years ago, when AAUP did its survey, a lot fewer faculty, say for example, off the tenure track, were involved in governance, and now it's the norm. So things are moving quite rapidly in this arena. So I don't know what's going to happen exactly with compensation. So thanks for that question. And I don't know if you started at the beginning about the lack of consistent policies, and I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, or the issue around how to get to more consistent policies, because that is where we were at USC. We're a highly decentralized campus that does not do well with starting with policies that come down that affect deans. Things have to bubble up often from deans. So if anybody's interested in talking about that, we could talk about that. But if there's a more pressing issue, because I want to get at your issues that you're really interested in. Yeah.
That's okay. Okay, so we held a table last night, and one of the number one issues that came up was inconsistency across campus. So I don't want to overwhelm where you're going, but yeah, that's one of the issues here.
Yeah, no, so as you think about this, because I go out to campuses and they have all different kinds of ways that this is playing out. So I think maybe the USC story will be helpful in this instance. So as a highly decentralized campus, we had completely different policies and practices school to school. Engineering, faculty couldn't even go to meetings, let alone have any voice. The School of Social Work, they were very involved in the departments. They had set up a system of promotion for their teaching and professional faculty. No such system existed over in, say, the law school, and engineering had even greater pay disparity. So every policy you can think of, hiring, promotion, and then the positive things like mentoring certainly weren't happening except for, I think, there was a little bit in Annenberg. That's our school of communications. So, we were aware of these incredible differences across the institution. We had established a committee that was going to look at the issues. It was a subcommittee of the Academic Senate. And what we were able to do was eventually over time is, we audited, we came up with a spread, the spreadsheet of the audit of all the different policies and practices that existed, because nobody even knew really all of the different ones and what they looked like. And we suggested to the provost that we hold a summit and that a member, they had different people from each school depending. Like sometimes it was one of the teaching faculty did the presentation, another time it would be a tenure track faculty, somewhere else it was one of the associate deans, but somebody would present from the school their policies and practices. And there were schools that looked like, didn't look like they were doing a lot to support. And I think not all the deans were aware of what was happening at their schools, right? So it was educational to see some of the kinds of things they could be doing. And each of the groups got to explain why were they doing what they were doing, what were their goals. And different schools have different goals. So the law school might meaningfully need to do something different than our College of Letters and Arts. So some differences were meaningful and important to those schools. Others didn't really make sense, and they learned about something else that was happening in another school that they wanted to adopt. And so we, after that summit, kind of like a year later, things started to change across different schools. And then when the Senate, a year later, came forward with a kind of some overall broader recommendations, there was openness to making some standardized recommendations across the school. We had tried to do that 3 years before. It did not go over because nobody at that time was ready because what the standard was that we were putting forward looked so different from what they were doing in the schools. And they didn't understand the value. They hadn't gone through the summit. They hadn't had the conversations. They hadn't talked to each other as deans. And through that opportunity to learn from each other, they were able to get to the point of making a more standardized change. So I think sometimes, we need steps in the processes. And I think for us, that summit was a step. It also created a little competition. Like people wanted to start to look, like they were doing more and instead of, it was kind of obvious some schools were doing a lot less and this didn't look quite as good. So we have a little bit of a competitive environment. So that helped as well. So, but I think, there's a lot that can go on in an opportunity like that. The learning, the kind of setting up sometimes like a little bit of competition, and then an environment that helps you to move towards a broader campus standard. And it really has been beneficial for us because, it's hard for me to even imagine now what it was like 10 years ago when there was no involvement, of the faculty in any form of shared governance, really at the departmental level, at the school level, across Senate. We have had regularly now, a chair of our Senate is, a faculty that's off the tenure track. They've moved into many of our administrative positions across campus. So all sorts of exciting things are happening. And just, we needed to think about a strategy that worked within our decentralized environment. Other things like that. We got a hand over here.
Hi, my name's Scott, and I have a couple questions.
Sure.
They're both related. So in my department, we are now majority non-tenure track faculty, and we have put in policies, for example, for hiring of tenure track. We do have a non-tenure track person on the committee, although they don't vote. And then for the hiring of teaching professors, we have a tenure track member or more that does vote. We do not currently allow, by our official bylaws, non-tenure track to vote for the chair's position. The last two chairs have refused to be elected unless there was a full vote of the entire faculty, but it's not there yet. So my question is, how do we move faculty around a couple of issues? One issue is tenure faculty tend to say, well, we teach and do research, so therefore we should be on all committees. And then the other one is more of a fear, and I think this has to do with the erosion of tenure track lines in the first place, that we are being outnumbered and the value system of the tenured faculty is geared more towards research, and we're going to lose that focus. Any suggestions how to deal with those two issues?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of campuses, one of the, and I think this is happening not just related to this issue, and it's a broader reframing in higher education, is the idea that all faculty are scholars, and that they think, that, for some faculty, it may be the scholarship of teaching. And for some faculty, it may be that they're involved with community engagement, and like there's different forms of scholarship. And I think one of the things that has been an incredible, one of the things that's made this so challenging is we've defined the notion of scholarship so narrowly. And Ernest Boyer was so great that many years ago now, is it 25, 30 years ago, he had recommended that, that that very particular notion of research that is, research university has overridden a broader definition of scholarship that has existed before that and will, I think, exist beyond it. And that if we reframe the notion of what it is to be a scholar versus researcher, right? And we don't lose that in that. There is still this, for research intensive institutions, for a set of faculty, there will be a focus on kind of original sort of empirical research, but that faculty are scholars in many ways, and that through that reframing, some institutions that I've worked with, that has been a way for the faculty not to feel a fear of that we're going away from something, because we aren't. We're all still doing scholarship of various kinds, whether it's the ways that, I think about, like, I'm a scholar when I go to my disciplinary society for, the courses that I'm teaching and that I'm improving it. That's part of being scholarly, right? And so I think that the fears, they change when people think about this in a different manner, but when that's your mind frame, I think that this looks different. And so I've seen campuses who, once they expanded that, and I did one of the surveys that we did as a part of the Delphi project looked at sort of, I mentioned to you about the future faculty, and the word that really describes what broad constituents, I mean, it was amazing. Whether we were surveying faculty, board members, policymakers, presidents, anybody, what do you think the role of a faculty member should be? And the word that they said is a scholarly educator. And that was what everybody came around. And so as we can kind of come around thinking differently about these, instead of the divides, we're all scholarly educators, and we're not losing anything, can help to address some of that. Now I'm forgetting the first part of your question. I know that was around the loss. There was something else, and I forgot that first part now. Right. And so that, I think I'm addressed that, but you also said something about, now I remember what you said. It was that the tenure track faculty feel like they have to be on every committee because they know all the realms. And so I think that, again, this appreciation of trying to get us all on the same page. And I think this framing actually works for both, because it's, and I have definitely seen this work on many, many campuses where they're wrestling with this issue. It gets back to, what they perceive as the traditional faculty role. One of the things I always love to present is how faculty roles have been evolving for 250 years, and they've never been stagnant. And we sort of have this idea that, there's this one kind of way that faculty roles are, that they have markedly changed in our history. So we're always in evolution, and sort of helping people sometimes understand, if they understand that the faculty role, faculty used to do a lot of student advising because they were much more kind of, the whole student life function really existed more in faculty members. You know, we could talk about lots of different kinds of things that have split off, come in, and I think are changing over time. So I think just both the scholarly educator framing and the scholarship, the broad, you know, Boyer's concept of broad, and I don't, are you familiar with Boyer's work? Yeah. So, I mean, bringing that, like a lot of our colleagues may not be familiar with it. So having them read something by Boyer is often really compelling because I think he writes in a tremendous way about these issues. So kind of bringing some of that framing to the table and the history, honestly, can sometimes be compelling because we're stuck in our moment, in the ways we've experienced, learned, and thought about this, and we just need to be, I think, pulled outside of it sometimes. That's a really, really important, and you know, that is one of the harder issues around this is the you know, the mindsets that have been ingrained about faculty roles that I think that are, you know, make this work sometimes really challenging. So thank you for bringing that question up. Yeah.
So I was, as my students do when I'm teaching shoe shopping while you were talking. So
Did you find something on Zappos? I don't know.
Yeah. No, just kidding. No, I was looking at the Pulias Center's website.
Yes.
And I am intrigued by some of the tools that you have in here.
Yeah.
In particular, the departmental cultures and non-tenure track faculty. And I was wondering if you could say something about those cultures, departmental cultures about.
Yep.
Yeah.
So out of some of the research that I had done examining, you know, I looked at a wide variety of departments trying to examine what the experience in these different environments, you know, what it meant for the teaching and professional faculty that were in these departments. So I ended up identifying these 4 cultures. So one was destructive, where sort of the environments between the tenure track faculty, you know, were actively disrespectful. So they, you know, they would be hostile to their colleagues, and all of the policies and practices in place were negative. So they were an afterthought, like hiring all the faculty last minute to teach, and you know, not being thoughtful of rehiring, so that you know, the faculty that, you know, they just sort of, you know, say, you know, 6 months later, maybe we're going to think about hiring you. So they had no sense of their connection. Again, no input on any decisions. You know, no sort of acknowledgement, and blocked from any like staff support. Like staff were told, don't help the faculty because, you know, we got to prioritize tenure track faculty support and things like that. I could go on and on, but sounds destructive, right? So the other one was neutral. And this was a culture where they were largely ignored. You know, they weren't actively disrespected. There was no active hostility, but there weren't anything sort of positive going on. They didn't really think about them. So they were, you know, they didn't think about putting in place, you know, let's make sure there's professional development available for these faculty. They weren't thinking about them at all. They wouldn't think about including them in governance. The third was inclusive. So these were departments where they really, you know, they thought about, like, we want to make sure that these professional and teaching faculty can have a voice. So they started to include them in the meetings, and they made sure that some of the staff support was there, and they treated them like equals. So there was, you know, this move towards inclusion. And then the fourth was what I called the learning culture, because it was one where they didn't just say, oh, we want to respect our colleagues, and we want to have, you know, try to make sure that they feel like an equal member of our department and community. But they were also thinking about, oh, shoot, we do a lot of things in our department that aren't facilitative of them being able to create the best teaching and learning environment. They're like, we probably should, when we bring in somebody new, assign them a mentor so they know this new course that they're teaching, you know, that they could talk to somebody if they needed to. You know, like they were thinking about When new tenure track faculty come in, we tend to do that. Why don't we do that for, so they were actively thinking about the teaching and learning environment and how they could do things as a department to better support the faculty in that realm. So then I looked at, in relationship to those different departmental cultures, what were how did the faculty describe whether they could, again, create a good teaching and learning environment, their willingness to do so, and really just, how those different climates made it possible. What were the possibilities for them as faculty members, and how those differed from those different departmental cultures. And out of that, we also created a survey that's been used out of lots of campuses that identifies what are, destructive, neutral, inclusive, and learning, and help people just identify where departments are at on their campus. And they often vary. So I've looked at multiple departments on campuses, and, they'll have some destructive and some neutral and some inclusive and some, they tend to be all across the board. The most common that I found were the neutral and the inclusive. The destructive and the learning are more outliers on both. So that seems to be like the more prevalent cultures. But the tools available to use, and lots of campuses have told me they've used it. It's been really helpful for them to self-identify things they didn't know were going on among their faculty. And really helpful, I think, for institutions that have used it more broadly to figure out pockets where there needs to be attention and work. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so I thank you for looking at the site. There's lots of really useful tools there. So I really, today I was told to focus in on the shared governance, but there are tools that relate to all these different issues about addressing best policies and practices on a wide range of issues for teaching and professional faculty. I don't even know. Oh, I'm like, I have no idea what time it is now. So I will send the slides, because there are some things that might be helpful for you towards the end, but I wanted to have us have a conversation. So I decided to, you can read on the slides, but I wanted to give us some kind of shared understanding of where we're at when it comes to, there's a lot of movement on this issue. I hope that this campus will, be a part of that movement forward with much greater inclusion. So thanks for having me, and I'm always available if you want to email me with any follow-up. Thank you.